so much. I first want to start off by thanking you for having me here. I know that this topic is at the top of many people's minds right now because obviously we're in the midst of a pandemic, which has been stressful for so many of us. And then we are looking at our kids and how to best support them. So today I am going to be focusing the presentation on discussing some strategies for helping support children when they're struggling with anxiety. But to start off with, I just really want to acknowledge that this is a really stressful time for all of us, and that it's really important for us to be able to find some compassion for ourselves while we're dealing with all of this stress, because we're just all learning how to navigate kind of this new world that we're in together. And when it comes to our children, we want to help make every effort to help them learn how to connect to the feelings that they're having, because they're probably experiencing lots of different emotions about what's been going on. Many kids have had to be out of school since March, which is a very long time, which can make it really stressful to reintegrate in school. Many families are struggling with additional stress due to financial reasons, loss of employment, loss of social support and networks. So kids are all experiencing that as well. So finding compassion for ourselves and compassion for our children, and again, helping them learn to connect to the emotions. We all have a tendency to push our feelings away. So when we become sad or anxious or angry, a lot of us try to suppress those feelings or to push them away because they're unpleasant and they're uncomfortable. But emotions are a necessary part of our lived experience. We are human, and so we are going to have emotions whether we want to or not. So as I'm speaking today, I want to give you strategies for managing anxiety, but I don't want you to walk away today thinking that what I'm saying is we want to help our kids stop having anxiety. What we want to do is help our children experience the emotions, become curious about these emotions, and then learn strategies for how to manage so that they can continue doing the things that they want to be doing with their lives. And I brought this quote here from Lisa Dion. Calm is not the point. Connected to self during any and every experience is the point. Can a child learn how to be with themselves when they are anxious, scared, happy, angry, sad? That's the point. That's emotional intelligence. So again, although I'm giving you guys strategies today, the point isn't to make these feelings go away. It's to help learn how to live our lives as these feelings are going to be a part of our experience. So I want to explain that idea a little bit more because I know that this might be a novel idea for some people. Like I said, many of us tend to do this. So obviously right now, experiencing stress, experiencing additional anxiety is quite common because we are dealing with some unprecedented times, things that we've never really had to deal with before. So it is very normal for us to feel uncomfortable during this time. And we want to learn how to make space for those feelings. And I'm going to use an analogy to help explain what I mean by this. So I'm going to use my hands. And I want you to imagine that you're putting your thoughts and your feelings in your hands. So some of us tend to take our thoughts and our feelings and try really hard to push those away so that we don't have to deal with them. And so when we do this, as you can imagine, if we're walking around like this all day, this is going to cause us a lot of tension. We're going to essentially be in a tug of war with ourselves because we're working hard to push away something that's coming from within ourselves. So it's going to be really hard to get the things done that bring us meaning in our lives. Alternatively, if we take our thoughts and our feelings and we put them right in front of our face where we're thinking about them and focusing on them all of the time, this also makes it really hard to get anything done that would make our lives feel meaningful to us. So in our relationship with our feelings, we don't want to be pushing them away. Neither do we want to be overly focusing on them, right? There's another option, and the option is to just let our feelings kind of hang loose, just like I wish you could see the rest of my body, but I'm just letting my arms loose down by my side And just letting those feelings and thoughts be there while we continue to do the things that we find meaningful in our lives. And the reason that I have this image here, I've got a ball, right? I want you to kind of imagine what happens when we work really hard to suppress our feelings. It's kind of like taking a ball and we're pushing it down into a swimming pool. And as you know, if you've ever done this, if you're pushing that ball down in the swimming pool, eventually it's going to pop back up, right? It can't stay down there forever. So that's kind of how our feelings work too. Like I said, there's this normal, natural experience we all have to have as part of being human. And if we're working all day to keep it down, they're just going to keep popping up. And then we become even more uncomfortable because they come up. And that kind of leads us to be spiraling. So we want to learn how to make space for these feelings in our lives while not overly focusing on them so that we can't do what we want with our lives. So one of the ways that we can help our children learn about the type of relationship we want with emotions is through our own role modeling. Because what we want is to teach our children that emotions aren't harmful, they're not going to hurt us, they're going to feel uncomfortable, but we can learn how to deal with them, we can learn how to continue living our lives. And like I said before, they're part of the human experience. Every single feeling has a purpose in our lives. We're going to talk about anxiety in a moment, and I'll explain the purpose of anxiety in our life, but they're going to be there and we can't just push them away because otherwise, like I said, we'll be in that tug of war for a really, really long time. So we want to help our children learn about emotions, that they're part of our lives, that they're going to be here. And some of the ways that we can do this basically is helping our children learn how to identify the emotions that they're feeling, helping our children learn how to label those emotions as they come up. We want to be able to talk to our kids about how we manage our own emotions as they come up. So, if I forgot something in the kitchen for a recipe that I'm making, I can express my emotion and say, oh, I feel so angry right now. I don't have all the things that I need to make what I wanted to make tonight. I'm going to try to use some big deep breaths and try to get myself refocused on what I can do instead. So that we can show them that we have these emotions as well, and we can show them how we are dealing with them through role modeling. And this point here is a really, really important one. So children really do look at their caregivers to understand their feelings. To help you kind of understand this idea, I'm going to use this study that was done a really long time ago, but I think it's really important to still discuss today. So they took infants who were able to crawl, and they put them on this really long, imagine a very, very long table. And half of the table was completely see-through, and the other half of the table was solid. And so they put the child on the solid end of the table, and they put the parent way on the other end of the table. So if you can imagine from an infant's perspective being on the solid end, they would have to walk over the solid end and into the see-through end. And it almost looks like there's a cliff, right? Because it's see-through. The child would look down and see that it looked like a cliff, right? And mom would be standing, or dad, or whoever the caregiver was, would be standing way on the other end of that table. And what they found was that as the child crawled toward their parent or caregiver, the child would, when they got to that cliff part, they would look to their parent or caregiver to see what expression they had on their face. So if the caregiver was clapping their hands and saying, come to me, and looking happy and smiling, the child would, they weren't doing all the come. It was just a smile. If the parent was smiling calmly, or if the caregiver was smiling calmly, the child would continue and walk towards them. But if the child got to the cliff part and they looked up and they saw their caregiver looking stressed out, they would stop and they wouldn't continue. So they wouldn't continue to explore and find out that it was actually a solid place. So children do look to the adults around them to learn about what is safe in their environment and what isn't safe in their environment, or how they're coping with their emotions. So we know that they are constantly seeking us to learn about how to deal with what's going on inside of them. And we also want to help children learn how to express and accept their own feelings. And one of the ways that we can do this is by helping validate. So I started off this presentation today talking about compassion, so being compassionate for ourselves and being compassionate for our children's emotions as well. And one of the ways that we can show our children this compassion is through validation and through listening and through being supportive. And often what happens is that when our children say something to us like, I'm really scared of the dark, we immediately want to help solve that problem for them. Or, Lisa was mean to me at school today. She really hurt my feelings. I feel awful. Like, we immediately want to solve that for our kids. But what we also want to teach our kids is that it's okay to feel upset about something that's happened to them. It is okay to feel scared about these things. So we can use validation. So validation doesn't try to change the feeling that the child is experiencing. It just lets them know that there's somebody there with them. And that can be a really strong message for a child, because what we're telling them is, I'm here beside you as you're going through something difficult. And what is happening is I'm trusting that you can manage that feeling rather than trying to take that feeling away. And we've got these cards here, and they come from Family Smart, and you can find these exact cards on their website. You will be sent a link to the website so you can have a look at it yourself. But I just wanted to give you an example from this card of what validation might look like, because they've got some great examples on here. So imagine that your child comes home and says something like, I don't know what's wrong with me. Our initial impulse might be to say something like, you know what, there's nothing wrong with you. You're fine. Right? We want to make that feeling go away. We want to make them feel better. But it says here, as you can see, it says, don't say this, because again, the message we want to send our kids is, it's okay to have that feeling, and I know that you can handle this feeling. So instead, we can say something like, what's been going on for you lately? It's okay to not be okay sometimes. So you can see how those are significantly different messages. And so validation can really help our kids learn more about emotions and accept their own emotions. And we're going to talk about how sometimes we can use validation when our kids are struggling with emotions, and sometimes we can help them with problem solving. And we'll talk about that just later on in the presentation, because there can be times where we can help our kids solve problems as well. All right. So I did promise you that today would be about anxiety. So let me tell you a little bit about why we experience anxiety. Anxiety is like an alarm. So all of you have smoke detectors in your homes, and the smoke detectors are there to help let you know when there's a threat so that you can do something to protect yourself. Very similarly, inside of our body, we have alarm systems. And these alarm systems are designed to go off if there's danger, so you can do something to protect yourself. So I like to use the example of going for a hike in the woods. So imagine you went out for a hike in the woods and all of a sudden you saw a cougar. Well, you would really want your alarm system to go off, because if it didn't, you might think, wow, check out that cute cat over there. I want to go pet it. And then, of course, that would be really problematic. So we want our alarm systems to go off because they alert us when there's danger so that we can go protect ourselves. Now, I'm sure that many of you have had the experience where there isn't a fire in your home, but your smoke detector has gone off. So whether you're cooking something and there's smoke, and all of a sudden this alarm system is going off. So we could consider that a sensitive alarm system, where the alarm system is being triggered by something that isn't really a threat, but the alarm system itself still believes that there's danger. So it's telling you the message, get out of there, you need to do something, you have to protect yourself. And so just like we have these sensitive smoke detectors that are having false alarms, people can also have sensitive alarms inside of their body that are giving them false alarms. And these false alarms are going off in situations that might be everyday situations. So speaking to a new person, or attending school, or writing an exam, or doing a sleepover, or sitting in the dark at home in a safe place. So that is what I'm talking about in terms of anxiety. It's these times where our alarm systems are going off at the wrong time. Sorry, that's the type of anxiety that we're talking about today, because there's also the type of anxiety that we are all expected to have when there's danger. We need to have anxiety so that it tells us, get out of there and go protect yourself. So the anxiety response starts with this alarm system. Stuff is happening inside of our body. So we experience this physiological response when our alarm system is triggered. And the physiological response to anxiety is usually what you and I and everyone thinks about when we're talking about anxiety. But the anxiety response actually also involves the way that we're thinking, so the thoughts that we're having, as well as the behaviors that we're having. So there's a three-part system, and today I'm going to be talking to you about all three different parts of the anxiety response. So let me show you what the anxiety response might look like. So because we're talking about anxiety during the pandemic, I thought that I would use the example of the thought, me and my family might get sick. This can be a really scary thought. So the thought pops into your head, and all of a sudden you're starting to feel the physiological symptoms. You might feel anxious, you might feel uncomfortable, you might even feel guilty because you don't want to get your family members sick. So we're having this physiological response inside of our body. And then the behavior that might come is, I want to avoid. I don't want to go back to school. I don't want to spend time with people, even if they're in my own bubble. I just want to avoid anything that might make me feel anxious and uncomfortable. And that cycle tends to continue and go on and on. And so what we want to do when we're dealing with anxiety is we can learn how to use strategies at all three different levels. So we can use strategies to help manage the thoughts that we're having. We can learn strategies to help learn how to manage the physiological response that we're having to anxiety. And then we can learn strategies for managing the behavioral response to anxiety. So let's talk about what those might all look like. Oh, actually, before we do, why don't I tell you some of the red flags? So I was mentioning before that there's kind of this expected anxiety that happens when we are in a situation that is stress-provoking, when there's a real threat, and that's when we would expect to have anxiety. There's also this other anxiety that's happening when we're having false alarms. But at the same time, there is this expectation that people will have a certain degree of anxiety. Most children are afraid of the dark. Most kids experience fears of monsters. Most kids begin to think and worry about death around the age of 5. Kids around the age of 7 to 8 are going to start being worried about earthquakes or natural disasters. Like, these are expected worries and fears that happen developmentally for children. So one of the questions that I get often from parents is, well, how do I know if my child's level of anxiety is, within that typical range of anxiety, or is it something that I need to be more concerned about and they might need some additional support? So I wanted to share with you some of the red flags of anxiety. And just generally, before we get started, the way that we generally know whether it's like this more typical anxiety or something that we want to be a little bit more on top of is the extent to which it's impacting the child's life. So if it is negatively impacting the quality of the child's life, or if it's getting in the way of things that the child wants to do or is expected to do, then we know that this anxiety is falling within the range of wanting to give them a bit more support or resources or professional help. So here are some of the red flags that you can look out for just to get a sense of, is this something that they need extra support with? So are they experiencing distress out of proportion to the situation? Are you seeing them having really large emotional responses to things that you wouldn't expect to see such a large response to? Are they seeking repetitive reassurance? So are you sure everything is going to be okay? Do you really love me? Will we get to school on time tomorrow? And then also discussing those numerous what ifs. Well, what if I forget my backpack tomorrow and then I don't have my math homework? Or what if Lisa doesn't want to be my friend tomorrow and no one plays with me at recess? So those can be signs that a child is struggling with anxiety. Headaches or stomach aches that don't have a medical basis. So a lot of children get referred to someone such as myself when they're experiencing physiological symptoms related to anxiety. So kids, anxiety can manifest in children as, and adults actually, as headaches and stomach aches. And I'll explain why that is when I'm talking more about that physiological response to anxiety. The constant worrying, so the kids who have lots and lots of worries and are having a hard time turning off the worries, so they're kind of worrying for lots of hours during the day and about all sorts of different topics. Difficulty sleeping, whether it's having a hard time falling asleep, staying asleep, nightmares, or if they're having a hard time sleeping on their own. Unless, of course, this is culturally something that is a choice in your family. The perfectionism, excessively self-critical, or low self-confidence. These children might be performing really, really well, but they're struggling a lot. So they're crumpling up their papers when they're making a drawing that isn't just the way they wanted, or really beating themselves up a lot if they're getting 9 out of 10 on a spelling quiz or something of that nature. Feeling overly responsible or overly organized. So these are the kids that are like, hey, you know, we need to be at school at exactly 8:15, and after school I've got this and this and this, and they're more on top of things than you and I are. This could be a sign of anxiety as well. And the big one, avoidance. All of us tend to avoid when we feel anxious, right? Like if I'm afraid of heights, for example, I'm not going to be planning a family outing to the Capilano Suspension Bridge. We all have this tendency to avoid the things that make us scared. If you remember earlier when I was describing that alarm, the alarm is there to say, danger, danger, get out. So of course, our natural response is going to be either to avoid or to fight the danger. So sometimes we see avoidance, and then other times we might actually see the fight. And those are some of the overlooked symptoms of anxiety, because sometimes anxiety might manifest itself as a lot of anger and a lot of yelling and a lot of opposition and refusal. And so these kids sometimes might be seen as more behavioral when really what's going on with them is they're struggling with anxiety. But instead of avoiding the things that they're anxious about, they're feeling like they need to fight. And so some of the other things that we might see is hyperactivity, difficulty sitting still, attention and concentration issues, because it's really hard to focus when I'm worried about what's happening around me, underachievement at school or resistance to doing work, right? Like if I'm scared of doing it, I'm not going to want to do it. I might fight you on that subject or argue with you. Visits to the office. They might miss school a lot, and difficulties with social or group activities might be signs of a child experiencing anxiety. Often early on, it can be quite difficult to differentiate. Is this, you know, an attention issue, or is this anxiety? Because they can look so similar to each other, especially in younger children that can't really express what's happening inside of them. All right, so I said that I would discuss strategies with you at all 3 of those different levels. So today I'm going to start off by talking about that physiological response that's happening inside of your body. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'm going to show you a little drawing of what happens when your alarm goes off. And I want to do that because this can help you have language to explain to your child what is happening inside of their body when their alarm goes off. So as I mentioned, our alarm is there to help us if there's danger. So it starts a whole process in our body. So if there really was a cougar that we were trying to deal with, we would want our body ready for action. So what happens is some of our blood is redirected from our internal organs into our arms and into our legs. And when this happens, we might feel really hot or really cold, sweaty, tension, that shakiness. And all of that is just our body's way of getting ready to deal with whatever it's scared of. Because all of this blood is being moved around, our heart might start beating faster. We might notice a faster heartbeat. Our body is super smart, and it knows that if there's danger, it doesn't need to worry about digesting that food you just ate. It just needs to help you survive. So it turns off the digestive system, and when that happens, kids might experience butterflies in their belly. They might have pain in their tummies. They might have nausea, diarrhea. All of that is just your body doing exactly what it's supposed to be doing to keep you safe. We start breathing differently. These are your lungs. Because we start breathing from our chest, our body thinks it needs to oxygenate that blood and oxygenate the blood. Marian, I see that you've got a question, and I'm going to respond to those at the end, but I look forward to answering it. So because of that, we start breathing differently. We breathe in our chest. It's like we're trying to get extra oxygen. Of course, if there isn't a real threat, we don't actually need that extra oxygen, but our body just thinks it does. And lastly, blood is also redirected away from our brain. And that is because we don't need to think too abstractly or deeply when we're in danger. We just need to think run or fight. And so when that happens, we might experience dizziness, we might get headaches, we might go blank. Like if you're writing a test and all of a sudden this is happening inside of your body, it might be really hard to come up with the right answers. So it's important for kids to understand what's happening inside of their bodies and why, because some children get really scared when they start feeling this stuff. And they're like, why do I have this tummy ache? I shouldn't be having this tummy ache. There's something wrong. And that in itself can escalate the anxiety that a child is experiencing. So if we can help normalize and explain that this is just your body doing what it needs to do, it's just confused about the time. It's just trying to help you out. So you can tell your body, thanks for trying to help. It's just, I don't need it right now. It does let us know, though, that your body is doing exactly what it should. So it's working really well, which is great as well. And I'll tell you some other strategies as well in just a moment of how we can reduce some of the physiological responses. But importantly, we want kids to know what is happening and why it's happening. I have this slide here because I think it's really important that we take care of the basics. Right? A lot of times when we're talking about mental health, we forget that taking care of the basics can make a really big difference. So making sure that our children are getting enough sleep right now. If they're struggling with sleep, we can give them relaxation apps before going to bed. We can talk to our doctors about getting melatonin if they need it. We can learn sleep strategies, routines. There's lots of information on how to help children with their sleep hygiene on the internet. Diet, exercise. Exercise is critical for mental health. So we need to help our children get enough exercise daily. I have deep breathing on here because, as I showed you here, lots of stuff is happening physiologically inside of our body, and many of these systems are not things that we have control over, right? We can't really tell our blood which direction to flow in our body. We can't tell our digestive systems to turn back on. So we don't have a lot of control, but what we can control is the way that we are breathing. So we can help our children learn strategies to change the way that they're breathing to help slow down this physiological response. It's not going to magically make it turn off, but it'll help slow it down, and it'll give them something to do while they're waiting for the alarm to turn off. So often I teach children how to do deep breathing with bubbles. Super fun. I've never had a kid or teen say that they didn't want to use some bubbles to do deep breathing. So what I tell kids is let's practice trying to make the biggest bubble possible, because if we're doing that, we're slowing down our breathing and we're taking big deep breaths to get us there. The other strategy that I use with little kids is I get them to use a stuffy. If it's a teen, I might use a tissue box, and I get them to place this on their belly. And I tell them that when they're breathing, I want to see their the stuffy or the box moving up and down so that we're seeing that they're breathing deep into their abdomen. Some of the other strategies, I've got progressive muscle relaxation on here. So that's tightening our muscles and letting them go. This helps children learn how to release tension that's being held in their body, which is useful for all of us. And there's lots of videos available on YouTube. Yoga, and there are mindfulness activities as well, which can be really helpful because the purpose of mindfulness activities is to teach us how to be more present in the moment. And what anxiety often does is it makes us focus on the future. It makes us worry about what's going to happen. You know, am I going to be okay? Is my family going to be okay? So if we can bring our mind back to right now, when usually everything is safe and okay, then that can help us reduce our anxiety as well. I have this slide on here. It says build a parachute. And the reason I have this slide on here is to help us remember that when we're teaching kids new strategies, we need to do it well before they're experiencing a moment of anxiety. So we want to teach them deep breathing or mindfulness or progressive muscle relaxation in moments of calm, because no one can learn how to do deep breathing when they're experiencing a whole lot of anxiety. So imagine trying to sew your parachute as you're jumping out of the plane. That's not the right time to be doing it. So trying to get our kids to do this before going to bed every night or when they're having a bath. So in those moments of calm, so that they've got those tools ready to go in the moments when they're experiencing anxiety. All right, so I told you about how to manage that physiological response. Let's turn our attention over to how we can manage the thoughts that come up as part of our anxiety response. So it's important to note that our brain was designed for survival. So it is constantly on the lookout for negatives and danger, and that's what our mind is going to hover towards. And it's important that we either learn to ignore some of that or learn how to challenge some of that, so we can start seeing other things as well and not just focusing on all of the danger and all of the negatives. So I've got on here, thoughts aren't fact. I think that's a really, really important thing to always remind ourselves and to teach our kids, because sometimes we give so much attention to these negative thoughts that we have, or these thoughts about danger that we have, that we kind of get lost in them. But it's important to recognize that just because we think something, right? Like, what if tomorrow an asteroid falls on my head, right? I can worry about that for a very, very long time, but that doesn't mean that it's really going to happen. It's just a thought. And we have 3,000 thoughts per hour. We don't have to focus on every single one of them. It is okay that thoughts just kind of come into our mind and we let them go. Obviously, that's a skill that we need to learn because, like I said before, our mind is designed for survival. So it's going to have this habit of focusing on those negatives, but we can bring the flashlight and move it onto some of the other things that are happening as well. And we can also learn how to challenge some of that negative thinking. So let's take a look at what I mean by that. So I've used this idea of the red font to indicate the thoughts we want to kind of try to stop or ignore, or not like push away. Remember, we're not trying to push things away. We're just trying to let them be. We don't have to engage with them. They're just going to be there without us giving it too much attention. Like, we're going to have 3,000 of them an hour. We can't even pay attention to every single one of them. So we let lots of them go. But if we are going to challenge them, this is an example of a red thought. I'm going to get sick, which you can see here will increase that physiological response, and it's going to lead to that behavioral response of avoidance. We talked about this a moment ago. So how might we want to challenge this thought? Well, we might want to remind ourselves, wait a second, I'm following all of the guidelines, and most people who get sick overcome this. And again, this isn't going to magically make anxiety disappear, because anxiety is a part of our lived experience, but it's going to be less triggering on our alarm, which may allow us to keep living our lives while following the guidelines. Because if we engage in avoidance and then we have all day to think about the negative or scary thoughts, that's going to lead us to feel even more anxious, which will lead us to even more anxiety. So you can see how it can really spiral if we let that go. So we want to help our children recognize that, one, we don't have to give so much attention to all of these thoughts, and two, if we're really stuck with one, we can challenge it and remind ourselves we can challenge it. And let me give you some of the ways that we can challenge those thoughts. So if we are working on countering some of these thoughts, we can put the thought on trial. So what is the evidence for it? And what is the evidence against it? So Lisa will never be my friend again. What's the evidence for it? Well, she's really angry with me today. And she said she's not going to talk to me ever again. Okay, what's the evidence against it? Well, Lisa does do that every day. And then we end up being friends again later. So, right, like we want to bring out that other side too, because I said our brain is always going to like hover, put a spotlight on the negative, the scariest thing. So let's broaden that flashlight and look at both sides. Focusing on probability versus possibility. One of the things that we do is we focus on things that are possible. It is possible that a meteor will fall on my head tomorrow, but it's really not probable. So if I'm focusing on possibility, I can really build up a lot of anxiety by focusing on that. But if instead I focus more on what's probable, that'll help reduce some of that anxiety because I'll realize the chances of that are minuscule. So helping our children recognize and understand, we don't just want to focus on what's possible, but is that actually likely to happen? Has this been true in the past? So, if a child is really afraid of elevators, we can help say something like, well, what's it been like before when you've gone in an elevator? What has happened? Or how many times have you died when you've gone in an elevator, just to make it a little funny when you're asking the question. We want them to remember that they've done these things lots and lots of times in the past, and that every time it's been okay. And even if one time it doesn't go okay, that's quite small probability, right? Yes, possibility, but not probable. Again, the idea that our thoughts are not facts. Just because we think something doesn't make it true. Just because I think my friends don't like me doesn't mean that they don't like me. It's just a thought that I'm having. It's not a fact. And then remembering that there is something that you can do, right? Like we don't have to worry about every single what if for the future, because in the moment, I can do something about it. I don't have to just let it happen to me. So that's where we get into that more problem solving kind of piece. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. And then, of course, being curious about our thoughts. I said earlier, we want to become curious about the feelings that we have. We want to become curious about the thoughts that we have too. So is your mind trying to send you a message, and what might that message be? So for example, if my mind is really focused on, I'm really scared of getting my family sick. Well, let's be curious. Why might your mind be really focusing on that? Well, maybe what your mind is trying to tell you is how much you care about your family members. And if we can look at that thought as every single time meaning, this is just a reminder of how much I care about my family, instead of, oh my gosh, something bad is going to happen. You can see how that already is changing how we're going to respond to the thought that we're having. We want to help children avoid the unhelpful thinking, such as what ifs, right? We could go on and on and on with awful what ifs. And children often do. What if she doesn't like me? What if I fail? What if I never get into university? What if, what if, what if? Well, the future has an infinite number of what ifs. Infinite, right? I don't know what's going to happen. If you told me in December that right now we would be dealing with a world pandemic that kept us home and working online, I'd be like, that's not true. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We sometimes think we might, but we don't. And so we want to help children recognize that those what ifs, like, you can do that forever. So why don't we try to maybe balance it out with some other what ifs? Like, what if someone knocks on the door and hands us 10 kittens to play with for the day? What are some other what ifs, right? So if a kid is really stressed out about, like, what if I get sick at school? You can ask them, well, what are some of the other possibilities to help bring light to, there's lots and lots of possibilities, right? So you can do a few of those, generate like maybe 5 or 6 of them, and then ask them like, which one do you think is going to happen? Or what if Lisa doesn't play with me tomorrow? Again, generate a bunch of different what ifs and then help them kind of select which one is the most likely. Oops. Okay, so here I have a circle of things that I can control and things that I can't control. So right now we're dealing with a period of time where we have lots and lots of uncertainty about the future. And when that happens, all of us want to gain more certainty because uncertainty is scary. Our brain is actually designed to be uncomfortable with uncertainty because if you think back to evolution, if we were about to walk into a cave and we were uncertain about what we were going to find inside, that's something our mind would have wanted to keep us away from. Our brain would have been like, don't go in there, danger, protect yourself, right? So uncertainty is scary, it's uncomfortable for many, many of us. So we want to try to gain control, but we also have to accept that some things are just out of our control. And so helping children recognize what are the things that they actually have control over so that they can focus on those and problem solve around those rather than focusing on the things that we don't have very much control over, because of course that's going to make us feel more anxious or depressed or hopeless. So helping children recognize, here are the things that I can control and here are how I'm going to control them, and helping problem solve around something like that. I have an exam tomorrow is something we can problem solve around, right? We do have control over, am I going to study? How am I going to study? With whom am I going to study? When I'm going to study? There's a lot of things that I still have control over. And so in terms of managing uncertainty, we want to help children focus on one day at a time. Many of us don't know what's going to happen over the next few months. And so we just got to try to be here and present and in the moment and dealing with what's coming today. Adding structure to the day can be really helpful. One of the big challenges during that initial lockdown that happened was that people were kind of gave up on all structure, and that led a lot of people to struggle. So adding some structure in the day can be really helpful because kids really thrive on structure, right? Kids really, like, that's why we've got so much structure in school. We do this, 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 and this. Kids know what to expect. It can really help anchor children. Helping children plan for the pandemic when it's over. So if your child has experienced some losses due to the pandemic, the loss of graduation from elementary school or high school, or vacations that you had planned as a family, working with your child to plan for when the pandemic is over. I've said in the past, like filling up a jar of like all of your wishes, all the things you'd like to do when things are different, can be helpful. Just hope instilling for the future. Helping children trust those in the alpha position can be really helpful, because what's happening with some children is they feel like they're responsible, and it may not be that people have said that they're responsible for things, but some children just take on that extra responsibility for things that they are really not capable of being responsible for because they're children. And so helping children trust those in the alpha position, by alpha I mean like the teachers, the principals, the parents, the caregivers, those are the people in the alpha positions, and they're the ones responsible for lots of things that kids don't have to be responsible for. So helping children understand that, you know what, actually, you don't have to worry about that, because that's me, that's my responsibility. I'm going to take care of that. Can also take a huge burden on some children. And then, of course, just learning how to live with a certain degree of uncertainty, right? We have to accept that uncertainty is kind of par for the course right now. We're all in it. We're all dealing with lots of uncertainty. And so accepting that there's going to be discomfort, right? I started off this presentation by saying that we need to make space for some of these uncomfortable feelings. And it can feel really uncomfortable to be within that uncertainty. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about that third part. I mentioned there was the physiological response. I mentioned there was the cognitive, so the thoughts that we're having. And now let's turn our attention to some of the behavioral things. I've already explained that one of the main things that anxiety does is it makes us want to avoid. And so the more that we avoid, the more our anxiety grows. And it's one of the big reasons that so many children and teens and young adults are struggling right now, is because we have all had to avoid over the last while, right? We weren't going out as much. We weren't going to grocery stores. Kids didn't have to go to school. So they were missing a lot of the daily interactions that they were having. So we've all had to avoid, which has led anxiety to kind of grow. Initially, it may have felt great for some kids, right? Like, oh, you don't have to do school. Great. That was my biggest source of anxiety. So it felt like a complete relief. But unfortunately, now that we have to go back, what's happening is, due to the vast amount of time of being away from those interactions, being away from the things that create anxiety, it's even scarier to go back. Because what we know about anxiety is the only way to get through anxiety is to go, the only way to get over anxiety is to go through the anxiety. And with kids, what we do is we break the anxiety situation down into smaller parts, and we help them gradually approach the things that are causing fear. And I'll explain that more in just a moment, because that's a hard kind of concept to understand, right? Our body is sending us this alarm, don't go, don't go. And what I'm saying is actually we need to be doing the opposite of what our body is telling us. So I'll give some more details about that. But as I just want to add here that as we're helping our children gradually approach the things that are making them feel anxious, we want to make sure that we're praising them, that we're rewarding them, because it can be really, really hard to do this, as I'm sure many of you know. Having these really big feelings coming up and still doing something that is so scary for someone is so challenging. So we want to give them lots of praise, lots of reward, lots of self-care, for ourselves as parents, but also for our kids, because it's a difficult time. So that goes back to that self-compassion that I talked about at the beginning of today's presentation. So I want to explain why we actually need to face the things we're afraid of. So today, Barbara reminded me about another presentation that I did when I explained this, and I disclosed my biggest fear, which is I'm terrified of dolls. I watched Chucky at a very early age, way too early. We were at some friends' home, and their teenagers were watching it, and then I was exposed to it, and I just got terrified of dolls. So my daughter had this Elsa doll that was given to her for Christmas, and it terrified me. So what would happen is I'd be working late, I'd come home, and for some reason, she liked to play in my bedroom when I wasn't around, and she would leave Elsa nicely tucked into my bed, and sometimes with her arms out like this. And so I'd walk in, turn on the light, and there would be this huge, like she was tall. She was as tall as like a 3-year-old, right? So quite a large doll, tucked in my bed, just staring at me with these big, huge eyes. So what would happen is my anxiety would grow. So I'm going to use this graph to kind of demonstrate what the anxiety would look like. So the anxiety would peak. It would grow inside of my body. I'd have that physiological response. And then I would say, hey, honey, can you please come and get Elsa out of here? So he would quickly come, grab Elsa out of my room. My husband would do that, which led my anxiety to go right down, which felt like a great relief for me. But what was happening was that my alarm was doing like a little happy dance. And it was like, I just saved Gabriela's life. I'm like the best alarm in town. So the next time that I would come home and I would find Elsa in my bed, my alarm was ready to go. And it would ring even louder, right? Because it saved my life last time. So I guess this time I got to make an even bigger deal to make sure that I save her again. So again, my anxiety would peak. My husband would come in, relief, but my alarm would just get strengthened each time, knowing that there was danger, I was saved, it needs to keep protecting me. And that is actually how anxiety is growing over time, right? So the more we avoid the things that make us feel anxious, the more our anxiety is going to grow. So what do we want to do instead is actually stay with the anxiety provoking situation. But of course, that's very, very challenging. So I'm not suggesting that we take a child that's afraid of elevators, slam them in the elevator and say, ha, bye-bye, because that would obviously traumatize them and increase their anxiety as well. We want to break it down into smaller pieces and help them push through and empower them to sit with those difficult emotions when they come up, right? Because emotions, they're not harmful. They're going to happen in our body, and we can continue to deal and do the things that we want to do. So back to the Elsa example, if instead of coming to save me when I called my husband, he was like, nope, you gotta deal with Elsa on your own. What would happen is my anxiety would peak, but eventually over time, I would ride that wave of anxiety and that physiological response would come down. Our bodies aren't designed to maintain that over like a really long period of time. So it would come back down. And so doing that, my alarm was actually learning, wait a second, there was nothing dangerous there. I didn't need to ring that loud. So then the next time I would come in my room and find Elsa, my alarm would ring, but it just wouldn't ring as loud. And so if I stayed again, I would again be teaching my alarm, hey, look, there's nothing dangerous here, right? And so the way I might want to do this if I'm working with a child is I might get them to, just look at Elsa from across the room initially and get their anxiety to their alarm to kind of learn there's nothing dangerous about this. And then the next time I may be like, okay, now let's go touch Elsa. And so we just want to like take little steps to gradually approach the things that make us feel anxious and scared. So we want to essentially teach our kids to ride the wave of anxiety, to understand that they're going to have moments in which they feel anxious, because again, that's an experience, that's a human experience. We have these feelings, they're going to come up, and we can learn to ride that wave so we can do things that are meaningful to us or that we want to do with our lives. So that's what I wanted to share with you all today in terms of strategies, but I wanted to let you know of other resources. You can find a lot of the information that I discussed with you today on the Anxiety Canada website. So I've got the address here, and I understand the link will be sent to you as well. They really have step-by-step strategies for managing anxiety. So you know how I was talking about gradually approaching the things that make you feel anxious. They can help you create kind of like a hierarchy of things and start working towards approach them. They have videos for parents, kids, and teens, and they've created an app called Mindshift, which has all of those relaxation strategies that I was talking to you about earlier. So deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, how to challenge our thoughts, how to notice that our thoughts are there, but not have to engage with them. All of that stuff can be found on this Mindshift app, which is created for older children or teens. There's also a youth section of the Anxiety Canada website that has lots of strategies for teens, lots of information about what anxiety is, how to manage it, and so forth. There's also the Here to Help website, which also has lots of resources if you are looking to learn more. They have some screening questionnaires available as well to let you know whether you might want to go seek out some more support and services. As well, if you have any more questions after today, we're going to have the Q&A right now, but if you have any other questions that you want to send to me, please feel free to email me, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have. This is my contact information. And now I'm going to turn it over to you to see